final panel, we have three excellent speakers. The first is Christian Downey, my colleague, or until very recently colleague at the School of Regulation and Global Governance here at the ANU, where he's an associate professor. Christian's a political scientist and policy advisor with expertise in energy economics, climate politics, and foreign affairs. He holds an Australian Research Council Discovery Early Career Researcher Fellowship and was previously the Vice Chancellor's Postdoctoral Fellow at the University of New South Wales. Dr. Downey has worked as an advisor to several Australian government agencies, including the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet. Our next speaker, be careful getting too close, is Dr. Jessie Moritz. Jessie is at the ANU Centre for Arab and Islamic Studies. She joins the case following the completion of the postdoctoral research fellowship at the Trans-Regional Institute at Princeton University, where she focused on post-2014 economic reform programs in the GCC and lectured on political and economic development of the Middle East. Jessie received a PhD from the ANU in March 2017, and her dissertation received the 2017 Dissertation Award from the Association for Gulf and Peninsula Studies. Last but not least, we have Craig Halbmaier, who is a US Foreign Service Officer and most recently served as the Deputy Secretary of State's Advisor on Asia and Economic Issues. Craig has also served abroad in New Zealand, Uganda, Burma, and Kenya. Craig has an MA from Columbia University and a BS with honours from Cornell. He speaks Burmese, Swahili, and something I can't even pronounce, Uganda. All right. And for those who don't know me, my name is Aisbett. I'm an associate professor at the School of Law here at the ANU, and of most relevance to today, I'm the associate director research for the ANU Grand Challenge on Zero Carbon Energy for the Asia Pacific. So I'm really looking forward to this afternoon's presentation. And before we start, I'd like to also extend my sympathies to Ukraine and to Ukrainian people, and my respects to the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today. Thank you, Christian.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for the invitation to be here today. Let me echo Emma's comments and acknowledge the traditional owners on whose land we meet, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. I'd also like to extend my sympathies to the people of Ukraine and the dire challenge they face at the moment. So we've spoken a lot today about how there's an energy transition of various dimensions going on, and that's going to have profound geopolitical consequences. And I think it's clear to many of us that the changes taking place in global energy markets are going to reorder patterns of cooperation, patterns of conflict between states. Now, for Australia, that's going to present both opportunities and risks. Of course, we have some of the biggest renewable resources in the world, and if we act now, we could well gain an advantage in particular fuels, technologies, and export markets. And you have to say, after the weekend, it's probably a greater chance that the current government may start to act more quickly. If Australia fails to manage the risks of an energy transition, the risks of declining demand for our coal and gas exports, this could also affect the geopolitics in the region for us. To give you one example, of course, our exports of coal and gas have been a cornerstone of our bilateral relationships with countries such as Japan and Korea. So it's in this context that I've been thinking about a lot of things actually, but I've been thinking about two questions that I wanted to talk about today. The first is, what is geopolitical leverage in the context of an energy transition? We talk a lot about some of these terms, but what is it? And how can a country like Australia, which is both a large exporter of fossil fuels, but is set to be a large exporter of renewable fuels and technologies, how could Australia use those exports for geopolitical leverage? So my focus today is really thinking about how changes in energy markets might shape geopolitics. So that's one relationship, right? But the causal arrow could, of course, run the other way and geopolitics shape energy markets, then we have to look no further than the war in Ukraine to see how that's playing out and how geopolitical upheavals that we're going to see and will see will complicate the energy transition. So the first question is, what is geopolitical leverage in the context of energy? Well, historically, countries have used their energy exports to achieve broader foreign policy objectives. And you might think about leverage here, and I did say I've been thinking about these things, I've been playing around with some of these ideas, so really welcome thoughts and comments on this. But you might think about leverage along a spectrum. You can use energy exports as persuasion down one end of the spectrum. You think about how Australia has used coal and gas exports to reinforce relationships with Japan, with Korea, to build strategic dialogues, to ensure close level leader relationships. You can think about it further along the spectrum as a bargaining device. The US, for example, has used its LNG exports as a tool in trade negotiations. We went back in the last session, we saw some graphs about the increase in US LNG exports around the world. And of course, initially, the US fast-tracked LNG exports to countries with which they'd signed a free trade agreement. So it was very much a bargaining device in trade negotiations. So you can use it for persuasion, for bargaining, and of course, all the way to the other end of the spectrum, we might think about the role that energy exports can play as a tool of coercion. Llewellyn mentioned just before how China's restriction of critical minerals to Japan was potentially an attempt at that. So I want to take us a little bit of a step back and think about, well, what are the factors that might drive geopolitical leverage? And I want to suggest that they're a function of three variables. The first is energy security. So for a state to achieve some type of leverage, it's going to need to have a secure supply of energy that's not vulnerable to disruption by a second state. So a state that produces sufficient energy to cover its own domestic needs is going to be more secure because it will be less vulnerable to international supply disruptions. And of course, this has been very much, to use an example, the US since the fracking revolution. It was busy importing gas in particular, and of course more dependent on Middle Eastern oil. And now it's the largest producer of oil and gas in the world, having overtaken both Russia and Saudi Arabia. So it's much more sufficient than it was, much more energy secure. But its security is also driven by a second factor there, which is resilience. And by resilience, this typically refers to the capacity to absorb or adapt to an external shock. The second part of geopolitical leverage is whether you can establish a dominant export position. In other words, whether the significance of your exports to a second country is sufficient enough to exert some type of leverage. So you're going to need excess resources. You're going to have the resources to export in the first place. And you also need to be in a dominant position in the export market. So take Australian coal, for example. Australia is the second largest exporter of thermal coal, but its leverage is pretty limited because other countries that import thermal coal have alternative supplies. If Australia turned off the tap, many countries could look to Indonesia or elsewhere with limited adjustment costs. Whereas if you think about our metallurgical coal exports, I think Australia makes up about 55% of the global export market for metallurgical coal. That's coal used for steel and other purposes. And for some nations, such as China, although this is changing, there's much limited alternative suppliers. So you gain more leverage when you have a more dominant position in the market. The third point then is thinking about the potential target state. And I think this is really important in the context of what's going on in Europe right now. Because a state can have energy security, it can be in a dominant market position, but the type of leverage that it will gain will be somewhat dependent on that third point. So whether it can use its energy exports for persuasion, for bargaining, for coercion, will depend to a large extent on the vulnerability of the state that it might be targeting. And here, I think that two of the key factors that will affect vulnerability is both exposure and sensitivity. So how exposed a state is to a shock That is the duration of it, how long does it go on for, and the sensitivity to the disruption will really affect vulnerability. If a state can absorb a shock, can adapt to it, it can limit its vulnerability. And clearly this is why in the last session we heard about the EU trying to increase its storage for gas. That's to deal with its vulnerabilities. So you just think of oil shipping lanes, for example. If there's a short-term disruption, so the exposure is quite short-term, many states will be able to deal with it. They can rely on their strategic petroleum reserves in the short term. But if we've got prolonged disruptions, states will be forced to adapt by implementing measures to reduce oil demand and to think about other measures over the longer term. And this, I guess, goes a little bit to what Llewellyn was saying with the role that offshore wind could play in the medium to longer term. So for longer exposure, there's other measures you can take. So this was just some ideas I've been playing around with about how we might think about geopolitical leverage, the different variables, the different drivers of it. So what about for Australia? Well, I want to kind of use some of these ideas to think about how Australia can obtain geopolitical leverage from the rise of renewables. I think many of you in this room will be well aware that Australia has some of the best renewable resources in the world. The nation's solar resources alone, I think, are about 10,000 times our national energy consumption per year. And while, actually, well, I can read these words out. I wrote these words a couple of weeks ago, and I had, while Australian government policy is yet to embrace the opportunities of the clean energy revolution, perhaps that's changing, and a number of researchers here at ANU and elsewhere have pointed to the huge opportunities that Australia has to be a large renewable exporter. And you've seen the new Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, talk already about Australia being a renewable power. So in the last few minutes, what I wanted to talk about is now, there's a number of areas where we're likely to be a large exporter. Hydrogen is one, critical minerals is another. I thought I might just use the example of electricity exports as one example. So Australia has excess, we've got the excess resources of solar and wind, and it will provide opportunities for us to export renewable electricity. There was a recent study done by a number of colleagues here at ANU, led by Professor Paul Burke and a number of others, that looked at the two most likely markets for direct electricity exports. That was Indonesia and Singapore, and you can see up there on the slide. Indonesia and Singapore have a levelized cost of electricity that is around twice that of electricity produced from solar and wind at the best sites in Australia. Now, the government, the past government and the current government, there's no overarching strategy as yet to how we might deal with electricity exports, but the previous government did give major project status back in 2020 to this bid here by Sun Cable. And so this is a consortium that is proposing to build a 3,700 kilometre electricity cable, as you can see here, up to Singapore to directly export electricity. And with potential offtake agreements in Indonesia. Now, whether this type of thing gets off the ground remains to be seen, but there's a number of similar types of projects being considered and are in various stages of development. So what about the leverage? How would these types of projects be used to achieve broader foreign policy objectives? Well, across many jurisdictions, we're likely to see electricity exports, particularly in Europe and Africa, to be symmetrical relationships between what's often referred to as prosumer countries, i.e. countries that are both producing and consuming electricity. And so the electricity will be moving across borders in both directions. But I think for Australia, the initial bilateral opportunities with countries like Indonesia, like Singapore, they're likely to be much more asymmetrical in that Australia is going to be the dominant exporter. We're unlikely to be relying on imports of electricity to a large degree from any of our nearby neighbours. So how could this be used? Well, look, I think Australia's renewable electricity exports will help to deepen our relationships with countries in Asia, countries that are going to be vital to achieving a whole range of foreign policy objectives. For example, to build ballast in our bilateral relationships with countries such as Indonesia, countries such as Singapore. It will help, I think, if these projects get off the ground to facilitate not just strategic energy dialogues, but broader strategic relationships. As Australia hopefully becomes a key and trusted supplier of electricity in the same way that we've been a trusted supplier of coal and gas to these countries. Now, the other question is, well, could this be used as a tool of coercion by Australia? I think it's unlikely that that's ever going to occur for two reasons. The first is, and there's a lot of discussion about this in the literature, about whether electricity exports, and literature I mean globally, could be used as a weapon, could be weaponized, I guess, as a tool of coercion. This type of asymmetric dependency. And I think it's unlikely to occur in this case because countries are unlikely to sign these types of electricity agreements with other countries unless they have cooperative relationships. So you'll see countries that Australia already has a good relationship with, like Singapore, like Indonesia, agreeing to Australia becoming a dominant exporter of their electricity. You see this playing out, say, in the Mekong Basin, where a number of countries are hesitant about electricity interconnections with Indonesia. So I think one reason, I don't think it's in Australia's interest at all to use these types of things as a tool of coercion, but I don't think we'll see agreements signed between countries that aren't necessarily either close cooperative partners or even more allies. I think the second factor that these won't be used as tools of coercion is the vulnerability of countries is likely to be much more limited. In the face of the threat of coercion, most countries are going to have the capacity to adapt, to transform their electricity grids, to use renewable resources in ways that aren't possible if you're thinking about oil and gas. So I think concerns about electricity cut-offs being used as a geopolitical weapon are likely to be overstated in the case of Australia. I think I'll leave it there. My time's almost up. But I hope what I've highlighted is that as energy markets change, as we see this shift towards cleaner energy, countries around the world and large exporters like Australia are going to need to think not only about the economic challenges, the engineering challenges, but also those that work in foreign policy about the broader geopolitical implications that this might have. For Australia, the rise in demand for renewables, for related technologies, for minerals, is going to open up opportunities for us to be a significant exporter, and that's going to bring with it, I think, particular advantages to deepen our relationships and facilitate partnerships with key allies in Asia. But the other point, I think, is that this is a finite opportunity, right? Countries that move first are going to gain an advantage. We've already seen the advantage that China's gained in solar and batteries. So really, the time for Australia to act is now. If we don't, and we wait another 1 or 2 election cycles, I think we may never catch up to other countries that will be moving ahead of us. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Christian, for a very interesting look at Australia's potential. And I think, if I understand it correctly, the sort of diplomatic advantages may be more than the geopolitical leverage that our renewable energy resources offer us. Our next speaker I'd like to introduce is Dr. Jessie Moritz.
Hi, everyone. I'm really interested today to hear so much from the importing perspective. I'll just take my mask off so you can hear me a little better. I work on energy exporters, and specifically I work on Middle Eastern and Gulf Cooperation Council energy exporters. So I'll talk a little bit about North Africa today, but I'm going to focus primarily on the Persian Gulf region and specifically the 6 Arab states that make up the Gulf Cooperation Council, because that's where I've done field research. That's where I'm drawing my original data from. Can you hear me at the back? Okay. So we know that European Union states are in a rush to try and replace Russian oil and gas, and we know that they need to do this very rapidly. We also know that shifting supply chains and building new gas terminal hubs and building and phasing up production of oil and gas is not a quick process. It's generally a 5, 10, 20-year process, especially if you talk about where the financing comes from. and whether or not we can convince, for example, Middle East and North African producers to scale up production or to redirect supply chains towards Europe, while Europe is also simultaneously saying very clearly we're trying to transition away from oil and gas. So there's no long-term market in these countries. We're trying to convince them that there's a medium-term market. In the midst of this, Middle East and North African states are critical in the immediate reaction to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. These are, however, some of the headlines that we've seen directed at Middle Eastern states during this transition. They appear, at least in sort of public English language media, to be reticent to up production in order to replace Russian oil and gas production. There's even a headline, the top left one is from Al Jazeera, and I find that one particularly amusing because they are themselves, of course, a Middle East oil and gas producer. But if you see the subtitle, what they're actually trying to do is criticize the UAE and Saudi Arabia, with whom they've had a diplomatic spat between 2017 and 2021, and relations are still a bit tense with those states. So how likely and how able are these countries to offer an alternative to Russian supply to Europe? And what are their attitudes towards the Ukraine crisis? I really want to move away from the Australian perception, which is of course extremely and rightfully so sympathetic to Ukraine, to actually have a clear-eyed view on what are the narratives around this crisis that are being shared in society and among elite policymakers in the Middle East in these critical oil exporters. So these are the 5 regime narratives that I'm going to try and cover in my presentation today. I'll go through them one by one, but I want to highlight Kuwait as an exception. And again, I'm focusing primarily on the Gulf states, but some of these narratives you'll see across the Middle East and North Africa. Kuwait is an exception because, of course, they are very familiar with the history of being invaded by a larger neighbor. So they're very sympathetic towards the Ukrainian people's plight because of that. To go into some of the media, I think we needed to look at the Arabic language media, print, television, op-eds, but also social media as well. Social media is a very difficult space to research in the Middle East and North Africa. It's incredibly manipulated, especially in the Gulf. And it's quite difficult to disentangle when is a viewpoint coming from an individual, when is that coming from a troll, if they're claiming to be a Saudi national, if their profile picture is in sort of Saudi national dress, if they have a Saudi name, if they claim to be a Saudi national, are they really one? Or are they part of Saud al-Qahtani's Army of Flies, as he calls them, which is a group based out of Riyadh, who specifically and intentionally subvert social media narratives. So I wanted to nonetheless illustrate the types of narratives that you're seeing in Arabic language media on the Ukraine crisis, and just talk about how well Russian propaganda has been able to permeate that space. So the first narrative that I want to highlight is about, and this is part of a wider anti-democratic propaganda war that is occurring in social media space and in public media in the Middle East, in North Africa, in authoritarian states across the world. This first example is a response to, this is a Saudi, or claiming to be a Saudi consultant. He's got 30,000 followers. Most of the tweets are pretty critical of the United States, very critical of Iran, aligned with what I would call a conservative Saudi foreign policy perspective, conservative in the sort of hawkish sense, not in a religious conservative or socially conservative sense. And so the first example is where you see Zelensky being depicted as a pawn of the West. So he's retweeting a Fox News article, and he's claiming that Zelensky's wife must have figured out that he's actually a foolish pawn of the West, and he's burned his country in order to impress the US and Britain. A second example is deflecting attention and deflecting sympathy away from Ukraine, and instead highlighting the supposed evils of the West in particular, and trying to pitch this as I think some people have described this as whataboutism, but you're really hearing it fairly ubiquitously across the Arabic language media at the moment, is that, okay, of course, we should have great sympathy for the Ukrainian people, but what about the Palestinians? What about the Syrians? What about the Afghans? Where was the international mobilization when those people were being affected? Again, I'm presenting these views. I'm not suggesting I agree with them, but I think it's very important to understand where these states are coming from. The third thread tries to shift that David versus Goliath narrative that I think in Australia, the image that we get from public English language media is that there's a David versus Goliath battle occurring between Russia as Goliath, Ukraine valiantly as David. That is swapped in Arabic language media, aligning with much Russian propaganda. Instead, there's an attempt to depict Ukraine as Goliath because they claim it is Ukraine and the West versus Russia. And there's even an emphasis on, well, Ukraine is actually a very big country and Ukraine is well equipped, and look, it's all of these states versus Ukraine, versus Russia, sorry. Another response is not our fight. And to an extent, this is aligning with the principle of non-interference. But it's also responding to longer term shifts of US foreign policy, disengagement from the Middle East region and shifting towards East Asia. So that includes recognition of a globally shifting world order and the rise of authoritarian states. This is something that has been measured by the Varieties of Democracy Institute. They've actually captured that levels of democratization worldwide are backsliding, actually largely backsliding over the last 20 years in democratic states, but also that authoritarian states are feeling emboldened. So that's part of the context that's shaping Middle Eastern state responses. There's also, because of even under Obama, there was a lot of discussion about the pivot to East Asia, and that really worried the Gulf states because the US is a key external security guarantor for them. So when it looked like the US was leaving the region, they started to say, okay, well, we need to diversify our foreign relations. And they've done this to differing extents from country to country. It's one reason why you can see that the UAE in particular was very reluctant to take a side, they felt, on the Russian invasion of Ukraine, because there's a real, I think, attitude within the UAE of we are independent of the US and our foreign policy priorities are going to be quite different and we're not going to pretend that we're aligned. So there's just in the last couple of years, the UAE has come out as a little bit different from its neighbors on that. Other states remain a little bit more closely aligned. I mentioned Kuwait as an exception. Qatar is an interesting case, etc. The other thing is that there's been direct damage just in the last year to US credibility as an external security protector because of the way in which the withdrawal of Afghanistan, US troops from Afghanistan was handled. So that's been very widely discussed in the Middle East and is brought up in the context of their response to Ukraine. There are also, of course, economic drivers. Russia is a key partner of these states, particularly for Saudi Arabia through OPEC+. This gave OPEC Plus significantly greater market share, and it particularly has allowed Saudi Arabia to balance against the US in negotiations over production, even just over the last 2 years. They're also competing with Russia for some of the East Asian markets. So if they draw oil and gas exports away from East Asian markets and send them towards Europe instead, they're very aware that Russia is going to fill that space. Now, to an extent, that's happening anyway, being driven by market forces. That as the oil price has gone up, importers in India, for example, have said, well, it's too expensive to buy Middle Eastern oil. We will buy heavily discounted Russian oil instead. And so that's why you're seeing, for example, the UAE announced that they are redirecting some exports to Europe. They're able to do that because their oil was more expensive than Russian crude. And finally, I do think there's a key impact here in that these states have been investing billions of dollars in branding themselves as progressive, not democratic, but progressive and sort of Western friendly and particularly business friendly. And this response to the Ukraine crisis has been quite damaging to that brand. It's really revealed that these are, I don't know if anyone really forgot, but maybe has re-emphasized that these are fundamentally authoritarian states, and they are more likely to tilt towards an authoritarian actor unless economic drivers push them back towards Western actors. So I want to talk here about this question of whataboutism and directing attention to other communities in the Middle East and North Africa, particularly Muslim communities. So I was lucky enough to finally be able to get out of Australia and go to a conference for the first time in a couple of years. And I went to Doha, where I heard President Zelensky speak to an audience of Gulf policymakers. And in this room, the Emir of Qatar also spoke, and he did express sympathy for the Ukrainians, but he very quickly redirected the conversation to Palestinians and was emphasizing Qatar's relationship with the Palestinians and the plight of the Palestinians. Now, exactly which group these countries are redirecting attention to will shift from country to country. So for Qatar, it's about their relationship with the Palestinians. In the UAE, you might hear them talking more about Syria, especially because they're trying to re-engage with the Syrian regime. They're trying to build up ties there. Afghanistan, as I also mentioned, is also brought up. So even at this international forum where Zelensky is being invited to speak, you're still hearing those same narratives. So that's the context for how these states are thinking about these issues. I want to use my remaining time to talk about some of the logistical challenges involved in redirecting supply to Europe from the exporter perspective. So first, of course, within the Middle East and North African states, it's particularly Saudi Arabia that is the key oil supplier. There's a number of other states as well, but I don't have time to go into all of them. Some of the key obstacles to increasing supply to the EU have been discussed by other members and other presenters on this conference today, but they include, for example, the fact that domestic demand for oil and also gas in these countries has skyrocketed in the last 20-30 years because these countries have been trying to diversify away from oil and gas into petrochemicals, heavy industries, things that are very energy intensive, which means that they have more domestic demand, which means that they can export less. So that's one limiting factor. A second is that theoretically and usually Saudi Arabia is very reluctant to, they claim, bring politics into OPEC plus agreements. They argue that it's very difficult to achieve any real type of cooperation among the OPEC plus member states. And if they're seen to be taking advantage of a political situation in order to gain access and to sort of undercut another state's economic position, they would never get, for example, Russia to cooperate on a future production agreement again. So that's their argument. They're also, as I mentioned, competing over Asian markets, and they're also awaiting the outcome of nuclear deal negotiations in Iran, because if sanctions are released on Iran, Iran will be able to produce. In fact, the Iranian government has at least claimed that they'll be able to double oil production. Finally, there's the issue of spare capacity. And this has been something that's been debated in the literature for some time. How much spare capacity does Saudi Arabia and the UAE actually have in practice? They've claimed that they have up to 12 to 12.3 million barrels per day, or that they're able to produce that much, but they've never really been tested. They also claim that they're increasing production capacity up to 13 million barrels per day by 2027. That's certainly something that I put in the sort of opportunities box that I'm going to go to in a second. But it may be overall that Saudi Arabia does not have the spare production capacity that it claims it has, and that's really limiting its ability, however much it has primarily decided to respond to the European call for greater production, its ability to actually do anything. Okay, so there are still some opportunities here. For example, the presentation on Poland talked about Saudi Aramco's interest in Poland. Most of these opportunities didn't occur as a result of the Ukraine war or the Russian invasion of Ukraine. These are things that quite a few of them started to emerge in 2017. So they're several years into their development, and they're just being accelerated and expanded. So Saudi Arabia has been investing in Poland. I mentioned that the UAE has been able to redirect some supply to the EU, again, mostly because their traditional customers had bought up discounted Russian crude. But finally, I think it really highlights the role that Middle East and North African states, why are they trying to develop new markets in Eastern Europe? That's because, among other things, as we go through this renewable energy transition, Middle East and North African states have extremely low break-even prices, particularly the Gulf states. That puts them in a very competitive position during the renewable energy transition. Even if the oil price plummets and other oil producers go out of business, Saudi Arabia will still be there, they will still be producing. That's why they can afford to invest in these new markets. Finally, on gas, I wanted to mention some of the obstacles to increasing gas supply to the EU. The first is that gas markets are extremely tight. This is something that other presenters have touched on, is especially relevant to Qatar, which has prioritized long-term contracts. So they like to have security of demand. They like to sign long-term 20, 10, 30-year contracts with suppliers. The second is that they have market approach differences. This is just in that the EU would like to prioritize being able to re-export gas to additional markets versus Qatar, again, wants guarantees that any gas that they export to that country will not be on-sold to anywhere else. There's also some specific political difficulties across North Africa and Algeria and Libya specifically, but there are a lot of meetings going on. I mean, there's been a flurry of dialogue and diplomacy from EU representatives going across to this region and trying to say, okay, well, there's been a shortage of investment for the last 10 years. This is something that we can address now. It won't make a difference in 2022 directly, but this is something that we'll be able to scale up as quickly as we can. So I'll stop there. There are a few additional issues I was going to mention. Most importantly, that this really highlights the pivotal leverage, as my colleague was talking about, that these states now hold, and their ability to manage this, even though for them it's really more of an opportunity, but there are some risks involved. And it also highlights sort of re-emergence of oil and gas as its use as a coercive tool. But this coercive tool, as I think Frank Jotsto's presentation earlier in the day, is not a long-term strategy. If they try and cut off access to supply for any particular country, that country is going to look for alternative resources, especially in the medium to long term. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jessie. That's a truly original perspective for today's presentations. I really enjoyed it a lot. So our final speaker in the room this afternoon is Craig Halbmaier. Thanks, Craig.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for having me here today to discuss U.S. views and actions on the global energy transition and energy trade following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. As other speakers have done, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land and their leaders past, present, and emerging. Also, expressing solidarity and sympathy for our friends and colleagues in Ukraine. It is during grim times that we gather. Land war is again raging in Europe, and the wanton sufferings of millions of Ukrainians continues needlessly. The United States, Australia, and the countries across Europe and the globe have stood together, shoulder to shoulder, in opposing the lead up to this crisis and right through until today. The United States is proud of our unprecedented actions in response to the crisis. We provided timely intelligence, imposed severe costs on Russia, and provided billions of lethal and non-lethal aid, including over the weekend, tens or dozens of additional billions of dollars for aid for Ukraine. The United States has done much regarding energy, the subject of our gathering today. President Biden has indeed prioritized energy given its importance to Ukraine, Europe, the United States, and indeed the world. No one is immune to the impacts of this crisis, especially regarding energy. And this is speaking from a representative of the United States. Currently, the United States, as I believe Christian and others have pointed out, is the largest oil producer in the world, and we are indeed a net exporter of energy at this time. Despite that, the actions of a dictator half a world away can still severely impact our own nation's, United States, energy stability and security. As we look to Ukraine and resolving the crisis in regards to energy, the US goal is quite simple. It's simply this: the energy security and energy stability of the EU and Ukraine are essential for the peace, freedom, and democracy in Europe. In the pursuit of this goal, the US has been very candid and forthright and has published 4 core aims or lines of efforts to meet this goal. First is ensuring energy supply for the EU and for Ukraine. Second is reducing Europe's dependency on Russian fossil fuel exports. Third is the physical integration of Ukraine into the EU energy market. And fourth is accelerating the global transition to clean and green energy. If you'd allow me, I would just like to take these 4 objectives one by one and just to highlight the actions that the US has done either by ourselves, in cooperation with the EU, or multilaterally with the world more generally. So first, ensuring energy supply for the EU and Ukraine. Towards this end, the United States is enabling the additional export of LNG, liquid natural gas capabilities, to Europe in support of the Repower EU goals, something I believe has been discussed previously in this conference. We've also consulted closely with the EU on targeting our sanctions and restrictions against Russian energy in a way so as to avoid unnecessary harm and instability to energy in Europe. Multilaterally, we've also worked together with like-minded nations, including Australia, to issue joint statements at the International Energy Agency to help calm energy markets and avoid unnecessary price increases or surges due to panic. We've also coordinated the largest ever release and continued release of oil reserves in history. The target is currently putting out 1 million barrels of oil per day for 6 months, something unprecedented in the world to date. Moving on to the second line of effort, which is reducing Europe's dependency on Russian energy. On March 25th, President Biden and the European Commissioner Ursula von der Leyen announced a joint task force to reduce Europe's dependence on Russian fossil fuels and to strengthen Europe's energy security. Specifically, the task force that has been organized under this joint statement has 2 primary goals. One, diversifying Europe's source of LNG in the near term. And secondly, reducing Europe's demand for natural gas more generally. To this end, we are cooperating on new efforts to reduce greenhouse gas intensity of this LNG infrastructure, including some of these include using clean energy to power on-site operations, reducing the leakage of methane from the LNG operations, and then also the construction of clean and renewable hydrogen-ready infrastructure in parallel or dual-use capacity for these new LNG infrastructures. All these actions are a product of the joint resolve with the EU to end the EU's dependence on Russian fossil fuels by 2027. In addition to these efforts, on May 8th, the G7 issued a strong communique aimed at cutting off imports of Russian oil and reducing dependence on Russian energy. Of note in that communique, you'll have seen that the entire G7 committed to phasing out or banning the import of Russian oil. And then the G7 also committed to work together to ensure the stable global energy supplies in the near term while accelerating our efforts to reduce dependence on fossil fuels. Jumping to the next line of effort, the third on physical integration of the Ukraine into the EU energy markets more generally. Very little to say on this as an American, other than to say this is, while it's a EU-led endeavor, the United States is highly supportive of the initiative. Which would then bring me to the fourth and final line of effort in this goal of increasing the Ukraine and Europe's energy stability and security, which is accelerating Europe and the world's transition to clean energy. As President Biden has said, in the long run, the way to avoid high petrol prices is to speed up, not to slow down our transition to clean energy. Again, quoting President Biden, we cannot drill our way out of dependence on global commodities controlled in part by foreign nations and their leaders, including Putin. The only way to eliminate Putin's and every other producing country's ability to use oil as an economic weapon is to reduce our dependency on oil. So even as the United States and President Biden is doing everything in our collective power, I think in the short term, to make sure that we can readily access oil and the gas necessary to protect both the American consumers as well as consumers across the globe. This crisis reinforces America's resolve to truly advance energy independence, which means reducing our dependence on fossil fuels. This is something that I believe is a shared goal with our European allies, and that we are working together to achieve. As we've seen in the past, over the crisis, I should say, in many joint statements between the US and the EU, we've issued a number of statements, including that the United States and EU are committed on meeting the goals of the Paris Agreement, achieving the objective to achieve net zero emissions by 2050, and keeping a 1.5 degrees Celsius limit on temperature rise within reach. This will include a rapid, clean energy transition, renewable energy generally, and energy efficiency. These policies and technologies will also contribute to making the EU independent from Russian energy and fossil fuel exports. The United States acknowledges that natural gas indeed remains an important part of the EU's energy system now and through its green transition. The United States and the EU are cooperating on a range of initiatives to ensure carbon intensity decreases over time. Specifically, and just as an example, we are partnering on technologies and investing in new and innovative technologies that help fuel switching away from fossil fuels. We are expediting the approval for renewable energy projects and strategic energy cooperation, including offshore wind technologies. We're also accelerating the workforce development to support the rapid deployment of clean energy technologies, including solar and wind. And lastly, we're advancing the production and use of clean and renewable hydrogen and its supporting infrastructure. I was chatting with the organizers earlier. They said a short speech was a good speech. I'll try to keep it there then, keep it short, but really welcome any questions or comments that you might have after this. Thanks so much.
So I'd like to thank all three of our panelists for very short and to the point, but very informative and interesting presentations today. I'd like to invite the panelists from this session, plus do we have Llewellyn or Scott? So, yeah, can you come on down so we might actually get a chance to ask you guys some questions as well. And so, yeah, anyone who has questions for the previous panelists, at least those that are still with us, or for the current panel, so if you'd like to come up front, thank you. While people are thinking, oh, well, I'm just going to take my change prerogative anyway, because I'm going to out myself as, although I'm at the law school now, actually an international economist, and you can imagine sort of my heart rate rising at all the sort of let's just not trade, let's all be autarkic. And I would like to make perhaps obvious comment that an international economist would make is that there are two ways to be energy or food secure. One of them is, of course, self-sufficiency. The other is to have diverse markets or diverse places from which you can source those goods. And I particularly think this is relevant in the context of the energy transition, where, as we know, renewable energy resources are extremely broadly available. Every country has some, as several people have pointed out. However, not every country has them equally. And solar panels on every roof in Germany are a hell of a lot less efficient than solar panels on every roof in Australia, because there's a lot less solar resource. Why does this matter? Because critical minerals that we've also mentioned today are not so widely distributed and likely to be in short supply. So my question to the panel is, do we need to think about this? Do we need to think collectively about putting those solar panels and those wind turbines where they're most efficient and connecting them using relatively abundant things like copper wire and like ships for hydrogen in order to avoid actually cutting off our nose to spite our face on renewable energy security?
Perhaps I'll just open with a few quick comments. I actually thought about making the somewhat obvious point, but it's good you've raised it in the context of that one of the first slides that I put up with the denoting the rapid increases in dependency on these fossil fuel commodities, that trade per se is not a bad thing. In fact, quite the contrary, the EU as a bloc is in fact very pro-trade, and of course sees the benefit to it, and that includes with energy commodities. And this Repower EU vision and action plan that I and my boss, Ambassador Pulsch, mentioned, of course, does in fact talk about forging new energy partnerships with countries around the world. And just on your point about critical minerals, that's a good one as well. And I think the Llewellyn mentioned rare earth elements, for example. We can't be in a situation as the EU or other players around the world whereby we simply substitute dependency on one commodity for dependency on another set of commodities. And the EU is in fact in parallel to this taking action on critical raw materials and has an explicit critical raw materials list. And we are working with partners around the world, including with Australia, for example, for our FTA negotiations on building trade and investment partnerships when it comes to critical raw materials. So I think you make an interesting point.
All right. Yes, go ahead. And feel free to introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Rob Moritz. I'm a citizen scientist at the site looking at future transitions. So renewable energy in Europe will remain complex for some time to come, it seems. So using the sun cable concept that is being promoted now from the NT onto Singapore, what is the concept, what is the consideration and the possibility of similar kind of opportunity in Africa or around the Middle East, just as given the circumstance where there might be a favourable situation or favourable countries? What would be the scope of development in North Africa in countries like Algeria, Libya, and Egypt to produce large-scale solar projects and to export energy to Europe?
And sorry, just for the benefit of our online participants, I'll briefly summarize that question. And that was, what about, I guess following on from my question almost, what about North Africa as a direct renewable energy export potential via cable to Europe? Anyone like to say that?
Maybe just very quickly, because it's dominated the last question, perhaps Jessie might have a comment on that one. But so as I said, the Repower EU plan does foresee increased trade in renewable energy commodities, particularly hydrogen. Off the top of my head, and I haven't pored over the documents specifically, but I don't think there's a lot of explicit discussion around new electricity interconnectors, but it could be there. And also there was this big desert tech, for example, vision that was set out a while ago. I'm not quite sure where things are at with that, but and I think North Africa and the region is certainly foreseen due to the geographic proximity and other reasons as having good opportunity.
Just a quick comments from a non-engineer, but we're following it. The American Embassy here in Washington, D.C. is following the sun cable very closely, not the least of which a very good U.S. engineering firm, Bechtel, is helping drive the technology behind it. From my layperson's understanding, this is very cutting-edge technology, basically unproven globally. So it's, I think, a fantastic example of where Australia is can prove the technology that it indeed works and that you can transmit it 4,000 kilometers undersea to a place that needs it. And once, I think that really opens up some amazing possibilities when proof.
Thank you so much for asking about this. I think my colleagues have answered on sort of undersea electricity, but I did want to make a comment about renewable energy exports from North Africa generally. This is a huge area of growth, and North African countries are pouring investment into it. There's a reason why Egypt and the UAE fought so hard to have to host the next COP summits. A lot of it is branding. I would call it greenwashing, But some of it is also because they are themselves really seeking to develop these industries. And aside from direct, in terms of electricity transport, if you had renewable energy, it's one of the ways to get it to Europe is through hydrogen, ammonia, for example. And this is something that the EU is now currently collaborating very explicitly with Egypt, especially on this, but is also saying that they will incorporate more of Africa, including sub-Saharan Africa, including the rest of the Middle East. So blue and green hydrogen is a key hot topic across the Middle East and North Africa at the moment.
Yes, great. And that returns us to the dependency issue, of course. The big advantage of hydrogen or ammonia coming on ships from multiple ports versus cables, which have a similar dependency issue to pipelines. Yes.
My name is John, I'm a student at AU. If I could just very quickly as a prelude to the question, and I apologize if this was addressed in the first session. My understanding of the structure of the gas market is that, for one thing, regasification capacity in the EU is not itself the problem. It's that most of the gasification capacity is in the wrong place. It's in Spain and Portugal. There's very limited connections into France for historical reasons. We've seen Norway boosting gas production to record levels, but ultimately it's not sustainable. It's been done by deferred maintenance. I guess my question is, if the EU wants to achieve gas diversification, does it need to perhaps accept that some short and medium term increased investment in fossil fuel infrastructure may be necessary to attract Gulf producers to that market? You know, again, we're seeing in the UK, their LNG market, the interconnector physically cannot take more capacity, and they're having to now restrict LNG imports for that reason. So will it be necessary in the EU and in Europe as a whole to perhaps, I suppose, take a short and medium term hit in order to achieve long-term energy diversification targets? Thank you.
Thanks. And just briefly for those online, the question was about, and I'm going to paraphrase it slightly because it was discussed this morning. I think I put to the panel the extent to which, or how much is Europe going to be willing or politically able to make investments in fossil fuels and their infrastructure in order to go for the shorter term diversification strategy as opposed to the medium to long term move away from fossil fuel strategy.
Yeah, perhaps just very quickly then. I think you raise a good and interesting point in terms of regas capacity and the location of where those regasification terminals are. Clearly, you have to look at the infrastructure realities on the ground when you're looking at the EU as a whole, and in terms of how that gas is going to move around the EU. As I've mentioned in the slide, you know, there has been some attention that's been paid to that with new regas facilities coming online, and I'm not across the very latest of this, but as you may be aware, Germany is investing hurriedly in as I understand it, in new regas facilities. In terms of fossil fuels in general, I think what I can say about that is that the EU, I think, and its member states, echoed by my colleague from the Polish embassy, is resolute in terms of ending dependence on fossil fuels in general. You know, this has been a bit of a game changer, obviously, the situation with Ukraine, but I think it would be wrong to see that this is a renaissance in fossil fuels.
I don't have an answer to your question, but what I did want to say is it's a really great question. You know, as I presented from the the repower unit, so the document itself, triangle there, which has got decarbonisation, efficiency, diversification, three legs on the stool, which are all working in harmony with one another. But the point you're making is a really, really important one, which is there are actually tensions between some of these things, depending on how you respond to the specific problem of over-dependence on Russian fossil fuels, and the longer-term problem of decarbonisation. Why is there a tension, between these two things? Because stranded asset risk. So if you're investing in a regas facility and you're paying some billions of dollars to do this, you're expecting the facility to last for decades. Like coal, we talk about coal plants in Australia, when 40-year lifespan. If you're the owner of the asset, you end up building it. You can be sure that you're going to, try and ensure that you can use that asset for its operating life, so that you don't take a loss. Right? Given that you've made some assumed operating life over that time. So investing in regas facilities, investing in new LNG terminals, it's a good short-term or medium-term response of some years, right, to construct, to the problem of dependence on Russian gas from a diversification perspective. But you are buying yourself a problem, and that problem is that you're buying stranded asset risk, because as the EU long-term plans say, you want to electrify basically 75% of final energy demand, and with the balance provided by hydrogen or gas. So, I think it's a really terrific question and a really difficult question for policymakers to have to answer. I've realised that back of the head, and that's not great for that.
Not very good.
No, I've got a short haircut.
I can quickly add that there's just on Friday, there's a new deal signed between Qatar and Germany, and that's predicated on the plan that Qatar is planning to increase their natural gas production. They've been planning to do this for a while, but they've claimed that up to maybe half of their new capacity, which is really significant for Germany, could be directed through to Germany through this plan. That being said, that's what they said on Friday, and then this morning or yesterday they clarified and said, well, we're still very open to selling that on to not necessarily the highest bidder, but whoever is willing to meet their contractual obligations, which includes, and the complication for Europe is a promise not to export that gas onto other places. And it also requires investment in storage, in regasification terminals, etc. That's why Germany's been, and again, my panel members will know more about this than I do, investing in floating tankers.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I might just add one thing. It kind of builds on what Llewellyn was saying, and that's the political risk. So there's obviously the stranded asset risk, but also as those industries develop with new asset owners, potentially government subsidies and so forth, what you're also doing is creating a class of asset owners, or a larger class of asset owners, that are going to lobby for the protection of those assets, lobby to make sure that any regulations don't target their assets, and that they can have a long as life as possible for the commercial reasons that Llewellyn articulated. So if you're a political party or a policymaker thinking about how are you going to implement climate policies that overcome the resistance of incumbent industries, decisions that empower incumbent industries that are going to oppose climate action, has some downside costs as well.
Oh, hello. My name is Marie Bradshaw. I've got a background in oil and gas. I want to know, just to follow up on this excellent question, is the idea that you can have your gas infrastructure as hydrogen ready? Is that just a line? But my understanding is that you can blend in hydrogen into the gas stream.
Thanks. So this is a question similar to one I want to ask about to what extent, if I may paraphrase again, can these new investments be made dual and hydrogen or ammonia ready, both in terms of the gas blending of hydrogen? But I want to ask a question about these new facilities and terminals that are being built for LNG. How many of them are also having dual connection for ammonia or even liquefied hydrogen? I know that.
Given you are the chemical engineer on the panel, I think you probably talk about pipeline corrosion and all those kind of things, which are an issue, right?
Yeah. yeah, okay, I can reach back 20 or 30 years maybe during this. Yes, so there are, of course, limits to how much hydrogen can be blended in existing pipes. Hydrogen is a much smaller molecule as well than methane. So my understanding is the sort of safe bet is around 20% could be pushed up potentially, but you get more leakage in terms of the blending. Anyone either in the audience or on the
Yeah, I
panel?
mean, so the other issue that's been pointed to, I don't have the numbers in my head, is that the energy content is in hydrogen is substantially lower than methane. And so even if you're blending, let's say a 20% blend of hydrogen into your existing gas network, the energy content that you're getting out of it, my head keeps on saying 7%, right, relative to 20% on a volumetric basis. So it's not a one-for-one trade between the hydrogen that you put in volumetric terms and the amount of energy that you get out of it. So I think there are constraints around that. Right? And the other point, just to make it, because it hasn't been made, is hydrogen terrific, ammonia terrific as an energy carrier, but it's incredibly important how you what energy goes into hydrogen or ammonia as the carrier, right? And we know, we've done analysis here at the ANU. If you are using steam methane reforming with Haber-Bosch, traditional methods for producing ammonia, for example, to ship it, and you're doing that using, coal or using gas, I should say, that there's no gain relative to co-combusting with existing coal within a coal for thermal coal plant, for example, because of the emissions which have gone into the hydrogen, as the energy component of the hydrogen molecule. So, it's incredibly important to remember that how you produce stuff has an enormous effect on whether you should be choosing it as a decarbonised option. It's also dealing with some energy security issues out there. Really, really important to have that aspect at all times when we're talking about hydrogen blending.
Science from the Department of Industry, Science, Energy and Resources here in Canberra. I just wanted to build on the point you were making in terms of whole of cycle greenhouse gas accounting being important. But it's not just on the production side you have to be careful, but also on the use side. So for example, if you blend hydrogen into an existing natural gas infrastructure, you make a flame hotter, you can create higher rates of nitrous oxide production on the use side if you're burning oxygen with a high nitrogen content. I've had experience. So you need to be careful with that as well, because you're not supposed to really high. I had a question for Jessie, if that was okay. I was really interested in your comments, Jessie, around Qatar's reluctance to on-sell gas and to sell to someone who may on-sell the gas. I was just interested in where they're coming from.
I think in part, so the current Emir, or the former Emir of Qatar, Emir Hamad, he, before he became Emir, he was in the oil and gas industry. So that meteoric development that we've seen of Qatar is largely due to his own personal experiences in the LNG industry and awareness of the emergence of these LNG markets and his preference for long-term trading deals. I think in part it's the practice that they've previously had, is that they want to make sure that if they're providing gas at a particular price to an end consumer, they're not essentially cutting themselves out of future potential sales to other producers by having that go to spot markets instead. I'm not aware of where they are right now today on, for example, their negotiations with the EU about this, because of course it's pretty important in the EU context to be able to trade that across borders and to maintain the EU sort of market mechanisms. So I'm not entirely sure where they are today, but that's where they came from.
And just quickly for those online, the question was about why Qatar would be reluctant to let people in long-term contracts on-sell their gas. And yeah, I think them holding the downside risk only and the on-sell and getting the benefit of the upside risk probably would affect the price at which you negotiate. I think, yes, because
Ian McLeod, retired scientist, ex-ANU and Defence. A question for Jessie. There are obvious benefits in linking the North African energy market to the EU. is the problems between, or the problems between Algeria and Morocco should stop in terms of going across the Strait of Gibraltar?
It's a good question, and probably some of my panel members who know more about Spain's energy infrastructure can also comment on this as well. What you're referring to, of course, is that there was a dispute really recently between, well, there's an ongoing dispute for the last quite a while between Algeria and Morocco over the Western Sahara region. That's recently escalated in that Algeria, who has they have a gas pipeline to Morocco, have cut off that gas supply to Morocco as a coercive diplomatic tool. Spain, who is negotiating with Morocco on migrants being sort of facilitated by Morocco up into Europe through Spain, was negotiating with Morocco and offered to help them with their gas security and to offer to sell them and transport gas down the pipeline. And this then angered Algeria, who said, well, we export gas to Spain and you certainly can't use our Algerian gas and then re-export it back to Morocco. That would defeat the purpose of our blockade. My understanding is that Spain backed down from that. Maybe one of my members on the panel can talk a little bit more about the Spanish position. But this does show you how many of these deals run into internal North African politics. It's the same with Libya. Libya has an enormous amount of natural gas. Naturally, it would be a fantastic producer, but there's a civil war. And also Russia's Gazprom is very, has high penetration of the Libyan market. And so that makes Libya a less viable option because of politics, because of local politics, instability, etc.
Anyone else want to comment on that?
I was going to say, that sounded like a yes to me.
Right, yeah.
The showstopper.
This is perhaps a follow-up comment, and I appreciate that this is outside the Centre for European Studies, but you know, the Flame Conference was held in the Netherlands very recently, Europe's big natural gas producer and consumer conference. And I know for a fact that two of Asia's very large LNG importers expressed serious concern that the huge demand for LNG in Europe is unbalancing the Northeast Asian market. JKN is at very, very high levels. And you know, Northeast Asia has their winter at the same time as the EU, obviously, so we see demand spiking at the same time. I guess my question would be, and you see the same thing in South Asia, there are concerns about rising energy prices there. I guess my question, and maybe this is more of a comment, is how can we balance the EU's clear need to get off Russian fossil fuels with the fact that Asia is LNG's largest largest customer by far. It's China, Japan, Korea, Taiwan are really the big customers in the LNG market. How do we balance these competing?
So the question for those online was about the implications for Asia, particularly North Asia, of the rising gas prices as a result from the Europeans' boycott or I'm trying to talk German, efforts to decrease their dependency on Russian fossil fuels.
Maybe I'll just say something quickly. So, yeah, gas markets, clearly, as you're well aware, are very tight at the moment. From the EU perspective, we have been talking to, for example, South Korea and Japan. We had the EU-Japan summit just on the 12th, I think it was, and there was multiple references, of course, in the joint statement to energy, the energy transition, but LNG. And I understand Japan has helped out in terms of helping with cargoes being diverted to Europe. But I think you're making a lot of good points, and that we are talking about global marketplaces here, and there are certain commercial and logistical realities that one has to view all this stuff, through a realistic prism. And ultimately, gas is going to flow to whoever's going to stump up the money to pay for it. I mean, there's all this messy geopolitics going on, and countries will definitely help each other, but there are these commercial and logistical realities in the mix as well. And perhaps just to very quickly add, in the context of Australia, for example, because we haven't talked about that very much, Australia is very much centred on selling LNG to Asian customers, and there were sort of remarks, perhaps made partly for political reasons, but there were remarks made by certain politicians saying, well, let's help Europe by sending cargoes to Europe, help Europe how we can, and in some ways that's very, very welcome, and I think Australia certainly can play a constructive role, but these are private companies making decisions in the best interests of their shareholders, and certainly some of the companies can help in terms of potentially lifting up supplies to Asian customers, increasing supplies to Asian customers in as much as their capacity allows. But you have to be realistic about this. And I think it's good you raised this point.
Well, there's a couple of I guess, additional things to say about that. So I'll probably speak a bit on Turkey. It's a couple of years since I looked at the gas markets in detail. But one thing to say is, maybe we're in a much better position than we were, some years ago, because LNG spot market is a thing, and not too many years ago, it really wasn't. There weren't significant volumes being traded on spot within Northeast Asia that would enable this kind of cargoes to free up unless you had some kind of government agreement, right, that would enable you to get around that problem. That's on the volume side. And then on the price side, right, tight markets, high prices, people are suffering because of high energy costs. The other point, I guess, to make about that is, at least a couple of years ago, this may be shifting because because of the development of the spot market, we may have more gas-based pricing. But I mean, Northeast Asian gas historically has been priced on which crude cocktail has basically been priced off the oil market. So that's not a point to say that people aren't hurting, but it's saying that the pricing associated with gas has been derivative of the oil market rather than the underlying tightness of a physical supply within the gas market itself, just as a historical artifact of not having Singapore or some other location acting as a gas trading hub. So it gets a little complicated on the price side of the risk associated with having a tight gas market as opposed to the physical side. And the only point, as I said, I would make there is that we're in terms of market structure, we're in a much better place than we were even 5 years ago, let's say, because of the growth in spot cargoes in Northeast Asia.
I think we have time for one more question, if anyone has one. If no one in the audience, do any of the panelists have a question for each other?
So I do have a question, and thanks for your presentation. My question was about what the end game is. So there's kind of in the discussion vis-a-vis Russia, there are two kind of things going on here. One is about sanctions. The sanctions, in my mind, are about punishment in order to change behaviour. And you would expect the sanctions to be removed once behaviour changed, right? So if Russia walked out of Ukraine, you would release the sanctions, right? The second point, as you see in the EU's policies, which are much more about a kind of fundamental underlying structural shift away from the use of Russian fossil fuels, not for decarbonisation reasons, but for kind of things more to do with geopolitics. So I was wondering where the US government sees this. Like, what is the end game, not in terms of the Putin government, but in terms of kind of energy policy in this space? Are we talking about sanctions, which are a short-term way of trying to change the behaviour of other states? Or are we talking about, what would be a really big shift, right? Which would just say, we're not going to let Russia be a significant player in fossil fuel markets, moving forward as much as we possibly can.
Sure, it's a good question. Thank you. So just from
feel free to talk to everyone.
Sure. So just from Washington's perspective, I think the key emphasis from the Biden administration, from not even day one, but well before Russia's invasion of Ukraine, has been coordination with partners and allies. So to answer that question, it would start with a consultation with the partners partners and allies, not the least of which would be the EU and Ukraine. That being said, the stated goal of our sanctions on energy, on Russian fossil fuels specifically, is just degrading the capability of Russia to make war. So that's the key. So if there was an end game, I think that is the metric it's going to be held against, is how much is Russia able to continue to commit war against Ukraine or other countries. And so if to talk about the sanctions and export controls a bit more broadly, President Biden, I believe, recently announced that we have suspended, as many Western countries have, exports of critical technologies necessary to Russian tank production. So we've actually seen 2 Russian tank factories shut down operations. They do not have the little widgets they need to make or repair tanks. So that is the goal. Then I think in parallel to that, there is that transition to a net zero carbon future, which I think one is just a critical emphasis, or it's at a critical stage for the globe, but also the good that it can do. I think for increasing the sovereignty of countries is another goal. It's just the ability, and I think Australia shares this, and we've seen Australia being very forward-leaning on the goal of not allowing countries to be coerced in the wherever it be, here in the Indo-Pacific or in Europe. So the more that we see countries being cleaner and greener, we view them as being more sovereign and less vulnerable to coercion. So
All right, please join me in thanking our excellent panel this afternoon.